Hi, and welcome to this recording of PAS 7050 webinar part one. There is a part two, which will be on a separate recording, and hopefully you can enjoy that one after watching this one. My name is Geraldine Koch. I'll briefly explain who I am and introduce myself, and we have the lovely Mark Gardner here as well, who will introduce himself in a moment. So I'm a product safety consultant and have been working in product safety for 20 years. Work with many trading standards officers on risk assessment and product safety. And I'm also the technical author of PAS 7100, which is about recalls and corrective action, which should be read. You need to really read it as well with PAS 7050, which is what this webinar is about, on bringing safer products to market. And then also the technical author of PAS 7055, which is on button and coin batteries. The technical author doesn't do all of the work or all of the writing at all. It's with an amazing steering group of which Mark was part of, and we had lots of other members, which I'm really grateful to as well. And we will mention them a bit later on. I was also the project manager for the UK Injury Data Collection Project, which was sponsored by the Office of Product Safety and Standards, who have also sponsored this webinar, along with the Chartered Trading Standards Institute. So a massive thank you to them. And that actual project on injury data was run by ROSPA, which is the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents. I've also been the technical expert for a number of EU projects, one on SPEAK, which was Safe Non-Food Consumer Products in the EU and China, and also for CASP, which Mark has also worked on with me with those projects. Okay, over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Geraldine. And so my name is Mark Gardner. I've been in product regulation and market regulation for approaching 35 years now. I worked in trading standards for 28 of those years as a product safety specialist. I now work as a consultant. I provide advice to economic operators, government departments in the UK, EU, and also other countries as well. I do lots and lots of training for regulators all over the world on product safety regulation, and my specific area of focus is risk, and that's product risk as well as market and process risk. I'm an expert witness for product risk assessment and also for conformity assessment. When I worked in trading standards, I was chair of the Low Voltage Directive Administrative Cooperation Group in Europe, but I also chaired the National Product Safety Focus Group, the South West Regional Product Safety Group, and various other strategic level product safety organizations. CTSI, lead officer for product safety, but I'm also involved heavily in the training and qualification of trading standards officers as a portfolio verifier, a portfolio author. I'm a regulating markets examiner and product safety examiner. So I do lots around that. And as Geraldine says, I was on the steering group for PAS 7050.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, so in the sessions, there's two sessions. So this is part one of two webinars that hopefully you'll be able to enjoy. This one here, part one, is really setting the scene, and it's the introduction to what is PAS 7050. So Mark and I are going to do that. Why is a PAS needed? You know, what is a PAS? Maybe you don't even know what a PAS is. And the general principles of product safety covered in PAS 7050 and of course 7100, because they really need to be read together. So we're just setting the scene. And then later on, if you watch part two, then you'll be able to understand a bit more about how you prepare a PSMP, which is a product safety management plan, and also how you prepare a product safety incident plan, PSIP. PSIP is covered in PAS 7100. And a PSMP is covered in PAS 7050. It doesn't really matter what you call it. I always joke with Mark, like you can call it a fairy plan or something. You need to think of a better name, but you can call it whatever you like, and we will explain a bit more about that in the part two of this webinar. And of course, applying it into practice and just looking at a few case studies, which you might be aware of. Okay, over to you, Mark, to give a bit of background.
So what are we talking about here? Well, and what is the PAS? Well, the PAS is really a means of demystifying the huge complexity which it would appear exists in product safety regulation, And actually, it's about the underlying principles of product regulation and product safety regulation, which is the management of product risk and the management of market risk. So what regulation does, when you strip away everything, all the detail, is it says, quite simply, design a safe product and then continue to manufacture consistently that same safe product. That's what conformity assessment is. That's what design risk management and production risk management is. So it is simply about the procedures you put in place to, first of all, check that your product design is safe, and then afterwards, have systems in place to ensure that's what you manufacture on a consistent basis. Now, there is a lot of detail for a lot of different products, but when you drill down, that's all any of the regulation says, because that provides a tolerable level of risk for consumers and for the market. So I've already mentioned conformity assessment, but what is it? It's a term that's bandied around a lot in both UK and EU legislation. It's a process that has to be undertaken whenever a product has a conformity mark, such as a CE or a UKCA mark applied to it. And it can only be carried out by the manufacturer of the product, because it involves an understanding of the design process, the design verification against whatever parameters are set by the legislation, but also the systems in place to ensure production is consistent to that specification. So it is a process carried out by the manufacturer of demonstrating whether specified requirements relating to a product have been fulfilled. And it does cover both the design and the production phase. And that is crucial. Quite often, businesses are very good at designing safe products, but then they don't have in place sufficient procedures to ensure that what they manufacture is exactly the same as that. And many of the investigations I undertook when I worked as a trading standards investigator related not to the original design of the product, but actually something that occurred afterwards, something that occurred in the production process. And that's something that you've got to carry. You've got to undertake the design verification and the production control, and you've got to document it. And we'll come on to documentation in a minute. But the one thing that's got to be emphasized is a test report in isolation is not conformity assessment. The reason being is a test report is only a verification that a single product tested met whatever requirements were applied to it. And so test reports are a significant part of the conformity assessment process, because it's the verification of conformity, but it's only part of the picture. So there's lots of different systems of conformity assessment, and the actual system used, and the system used will always be specified in the regulation. The system used will be dependent upon the risk presented by a non-compliant product. So that's a function of the product itself, but also the maturity of the market and the maturity of standards. And so those conformity assessment systems are determined by the legislator, but it is a risk-based process. And just to highlight the point and to ensure that it's driven home, conformity assessment is the responsibility of the manufacturer. It can't be carried out effectively by those downstream in the supply chain. You can't inspect or test in conformity assessment. Inspection and test is part of a quality control procedure, but you can't check that all products meet a predetermined specification for safety unless you test every single product. And therefore it's part of the process. So where does all this come from, this conformity assessment? Well, it kind of came around in 2008. Prior to 2008, there were regulations requiring products to be conformity assessed, but there was no a consistency between regulation. And there was different requirements could be applied to the same product simultaneously, and they actually sometimes contradicted each other. So in 2008, a European decision was published, 768/2008, which is basically the new approach to the new approach being conformity assessment. And this decision provided a common framework for the marketing of products, contains provisions on market surveillance, obligations for businesses wherever they sit in the supply chain, traceability, and also something called the safeguard procedure. The safeguard procedure applies to those businesses who are operating within the single market, which also includes Northern Ireland at the moment. And so these provisions are now being incorporated into sector-specific regulations as part of something called the alignment package. So it's a way of establishing consistency in regulatory requirements. And the entire paradigm is one of passing on as much responsibility as possible to manufacturers and other economic operators. It is manufacturers who have the primary responsibility for ensuring their products are safe. The regulator is not involved. So it's up to you to do that. And you do that through the process of conformity assessment and the documentation of that. So market surveillance, which is the approach taken by regulators, is to look at the entire market and determine where risk is. And one of the risks that they will look at is, has conformity assessment been undertaken adequately? And they will look at the documentary evidence of that. So it's crucial to the operation of product safety legislation to carry out market surveillance activities for officers to have the powers, competency to obtain, scrutinise and verify, or otherwise documentary evidence of supply chains, production control, and the compliance status of products. And it's not just market surveillance officers who need that competency. It's also those who are involved in actually ensuring the products are safe in the first place. They only act as the policeman at the end. You are the people who actually do the work to evidence to them that you're doing what's required. So the decision lays down a system of conformity assessment modules, and we'll talk about those very, very briefly. But we won't go into too much detail because the whole subject matter of PAS 7050 is the demystification of all of that complex information. So yes, that's what it is. So just a quick mention of the structure of the decision. A European decision is not binding. It's not legislation. It is still relevant for the UK, even though the UK is not part of the single market, because our legislation is still based on this. So this is just a quick overview. And it's just a demonstration of the fact that the majority of the detail of the document relates to the actual process of conformity assessment. So this document is worth reading if you are required to undertake conformity assessment in relation to a particular product. And it will tell you, in conjunction with reference to the legislation that apply to your product, whether or not, or what you actually have to do to demonstrate conformity for that product. So what does it mean? Well, if there's no evidence that conformity assessment has taken place, or it hasn't taken place, then there's no evidence that the product is safe. That CE mark or UKCA mark is your declaration that the product has undergone the appropriate conformity assessment and it is documented. Now, if there isn't documentary evidence, then that conformity mark could be considered false. So it's got to be documented. It's sometimes called technical documentation, sometimes a technical file, but in general, it's all conformity assessment documentation because it is evidence of conformity. And this documentation is used by market surveillance officials to assess the risk presented by the product or the compliance status of the product. So it's the primary obligation of the relevant economic operator to either assemble the technical documentation if you are the manufacturer, or to ensure that it has been assembled if you're the importer. Whoever places the product on the UK market has that responsibility. And if you're not the manufacturer of the product, you don't undertake conformity assessment, you don't have that technical document, or you don't generate that technical documentation yourself, but you take responsibility for that conformity mark. And therefore, it's always a good idea to ensure that conformity assessment has taken place adequately and it is documented adequately. So the old quality manager's mantra, if it isn't documented, there's no evidence that it happened. And this is true because the entire system of product safety regulation says that it's what's known as post-market regulation. Regulators don't get involved until the product is on the market. but it relies on manufacturers to actually generate this documentation in the first place. And if the conformity assessment process isn't adequately documented, then it means that that product will not be considered in conformity. So, if it's not written down, then it didn't happen. So we can spend a long time talking about documentary requirements, but actually what we want to focus on here is to ensure that you understand that this is a fundamental part of product compliance. It is integral to it. So just a quick overview when we talk about regulatory structure. Very easy to think all these documents mean the same thing and have the same obligations attached to them. So regulation is law. It has direct effect. So European regulation, if you're trading in Europe, has direct effect on that. It's made at the European level. Those regulations were also implemented, originally retained into UK law, but now assimilated into UK law. So there is a lot of commonality between both systems at the moment. And then we have directives, and directives are basically instructions on those countries who are members of the single market to implement a law doing a particular thing. A lot of the UK legislation is derived from directives. Directives fell out of favour somewhat within the single market, simply because an instruction to implement a law can be interpreted in many different ways, and it leads to inconsistency. And that's obviously a problem for harmonisation within the market. Then we've got decisions, Decision 768. That's what's known as a horizontal menu. It's something that can be used by legislators, but you also have other types of decision, which are instructions to particular member states, but also sometimes that provide working assumptions within risk assessment and conformity assessment. Then you've got opinions and recommendations. They don't have legal force or legally binding force. They don't have a direct effect on anything, but they are persuasive in many cases. And dependent upon the type of opinion and recommendation, that may well find itself being used as a legal basis for action. And then you've got standards, code of practice, and guidelines, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. So standards. Standards are quite difficult to get your head around sometimes, and there are lots of different types of standards. There are national standards, international standards, and then designated standards and harmonized standards. And a designated standard is a UK designation for a standard which provides a rebuttable presumption of conformity for your product. So it is a design recipe. If you meet the requirements of that designated standard, then you can reasonably assume that your product meets the relevant legal requirements. It is effectively exactly the same as a harmonized standard in Europe. Now, you will only apply the designated standard if you're applying a UKCA mark to your product. If you're applying a CE mark, then you will still use the harmonized standard in Europe. So it's worth making that distinction. Apart from a couple of very minor inconsistencies, the designated standard list is almost exactly the same as the harmonized standard list in Europe. So you can have that reasonable assumption, but you do apply the harmonized standard if you're doing CE marking rather than UKCA marking. It's worth mentioning that CE marking has been indefinitely extended for the UK, the whole of the UK market, and therefore there isn't a requirement, apart from some very, very notable exceptions, to use the UKCA mark at the moment. So, standards. A standards law, not really. We can get very caught up in both as trading standards officers, but also as businesses thinking, well, I must comply with a standard. You don't have to, again, apart from a couple of very isolated cases. Compliance or not with standards does not mean a product complies or does not comply with legal rules in all but a few isolated cases. But as I say, there is a rebuttable presumption, which means that basically an assumption that you can use in practical terms in most cases that if you meet a designated or harmonized standard, that you are complying with the requirements of the law that relate to that standard. But standards do provide methodologies which can be used to determine the presence and characteristics of product hazards. And many of these product hazards will be addressed in law. They will be quantified in the standard, but they will be addressed in the law. And the risk arising from that the hazard is the important element in terms of compliance with the law, and also the corrective measures that may arise out of that. So how do we ensure product safety? Well, I've already mentioned the word a number of times, market surveillance. Market surveillance is the process undertaken by the regulators, the market regulators who have the responsibility, have the obligation to ensure the market is functioning well and consumers and businesses are adequately protected. So that it's a very high level, strategic level consideration of what's going on in the market. So you find out what's going on in the market, where risk lies, and then you undertake tactical interventions to correct whatever is going wrong. And this is done at a national, but also a local level in the UK. So you have strategic plans for the UK as a whole, for Great Britain, and then for particular counties in relation to, or other administrative units in relation to trading standards. And that's really it. So it's a data-led, intelligence-led process where, and I'm using Wikipedia here, and I should not be quoting from Wikipedia, but actually Wikipedia is not incorrect here. And it actually summarised the process of market surveillance quite well. So market surveillance for products ensures that products on the market conform to applicable laws and regulations. This helps foster trust from consumers buying products or financial services. It also protects consumers or professionals from harm from non-compliant products. So we start off with, yes, it protects people. They get what they expect to get and they're not injured by it. But also it helps the market. The market functions well. If you're making a compliant product and spending a lot of money to ensure your product is compliant, and then somebody else is placing a product on the market and they've not done all of that work, their product could be cheaper and they could be undercutting you unfairly. And therefore, these regulations are very, very important. And it's very important that the regulations are applied across the board to ensure that there is it's a very British English expression, the level playing field. So everybody has the same opportunity to place products on the market and to sell them, and the market functions effectively.
So I love Wikipedia, by the way, Mark. But yeah, how else do we ensure product safety? So other things that we do, we also look at product testing. So we looked at this very briefly a minute ago. We have market surveillance, we've got product testing, design verification, production control, and auditing. So let's just take a little walk through the rest of these. So product testing, what's the purpose of product testing? We've already kind of alluded to this. I think we've spoken a bit about it, that, you know, the test report is really, really key, but it only looks at the hazard. It doesn't look at the risk. And we've got a really cute picture here of a baby, and I realize I should explain it. And the reason why that's there is there are certain behaviors, consumer behaviors, that we have to deal with when we're looking at risk assessment. And it's what makes it challenging for us as product safety professionals or quality managers or technologists. So it's really hard to predict those behaviors. Some we can, like we can predict with children, they will mouth things. They will always mouth things, even adults will do that. But the risk will only be if those small parts come off. So if this little baby here, cute baby, one of their toes fell off, then that would be a choking hazard. So you want to make sure that any small parts that are on any of your products are not present. And that's what the test report or the testing will do. It will show you if there are any hazards presented or can present themselves. And you then need to figure out the risk of that happening. So as mentioned here, it can only provide the evidence of the presence of the hazard, not the type of harm or the probability of it occurring. We're surrounded by hazards all the time. Where I am now, there's lots of different hazards, as I'm sure there is where Mark is as well, but we're not injuring ourselves all the time. So that risk is really key. So hazard is a characteristic which has the potential to cause harm, and it can be dormant or require specific behaviours, as we've mentioned. So it's an important element. Product safety is like a huge jigsaw piece, and testing is a piece of that. And it's fundamental to understand that product testing shouldn't be the final point. It's almost the beginning. It's where you start. But for some people, unfortunately, I think there's a bit of a misconception that product testing, that's it. We're done now. We've done our product testing. So our conformity assessment process is complete. We can now use the CE mark or UKCA mark, but that's not the case. There needs to be other things that you do, such as the other conformity assessment procedures that Mark's spoken about earlier on. So product testing is a really vital and important element of product safety and the market surveillance process. It indicates the presence of hazards, but conformity assessment procedures require things like product specifications and that they're clearly laid out. These recipes, if we talk about, if you're cooking and you've got a recipe, that's like the product spec. What do we imagine that the cake or whatever it is that you're cooking is going to look like in the end? And we need to have that recipe very, very clear so everyone's clear on what they're making. So I want to show you very quickly a video of testing in a test lab. This is toy testing. For those of you that might never have been to a lab or to seen any toy testing, this will hopefully give you a bit of an idea of what goes on in a test laboratory.
Toys aren't just about fun and games, They're crucial to a child's development. They help with movement, coordination, strength and communication skills. Come on, mate, it's my go now.
No.
Come on.
No.
You've had it all afternoon.
No.
I want to go. I want to go!
Before your kiddies get to play with their new toys, a room full of grown-ups have to check they're safe first. This cute little elephant is getting tested for any chokeable items that could be pulled off when a child's playing with him. A 3-pronged clamp is stuck behind his eye and then a 9-kilo weight is dangled from it. If the eye falls out of its socket within 10 seconds, he fails. But lucky for him, his eye stays firmly in place and he passes. Next up, stuffing. 2 clamps are placed 15 millimeters apart from the seam. A 7-kilogram weight hangs off, trying to pull it open. Alas, the elephant rips clean open, so it's curtains for him. Shame. Next up, impact testing. This machine has a 1-kilogram weight that's ready to drop down on little toys, trying to break off small parts or make sharp points and edges. The weight is lifted 100 millimeters away from the object and down it goes. But it's not all fun and games. This poor bear is skewered onto a rig and a 20-millimeter propane gas flame is positioned at a 45-degree angle and held at his feet for 3 seconds. To pass, the bear must burn at a rate of 30 millimeters per second or under. According to British standards, this is enough time for a kiddie to see the flames, drop the toy and run away. This little fella burns 240 millimeters in 29 seconds and has passed the test. But his burning hasn't been in vain. All of his teddy friends can now safely go to a good home.
Just to mention on that, the video there, so the lady talks about, the teddy, all of his friends can now go to a home and be safe, but that's only if the conformity assessment procedure has been followed.
Yes,
right,
absolutely. So yes, there needs to be evidence that all of his teddy friends are exactly the same specification as he is.
Exactly.
And obviously the video it doesn't elaborate on that particular point, but yes, that testing is confirmation. What they probably already know, that it does pass the relevant tests in the toy standard.
Yeah, and most testing is destructive, so the product's destroyed. So you need to make sure that your manufacturing processes are consistent to that one that you have tested, and that's really, really key. And it's probably where a lot of the problems arise, is that is not the case in reality. So one thing that I found that was really good, and I just wanted to share, is the IKEA test lab. So if you go to YouTube, you can actually see a tour of the IKEA test lab. And the key thing here that the gentleman talks about in the video is about simulating normal long-term use. And when people buy furniture in their homes, they're trying to simulate that consistent use You know, even in furniture in my home gets jumped on and stood on by the children, and they run about and their cats are on it or whatever happens to them. So they want to simulate that in real life. So it's about the foreseeable misuse of the product. So it's not just about complying with that standard. That's the minimum. It's about going above and beyond and ensuring that this foreseeable misuse is assessed for when they're developing products. And that's really key to see that in the video, and really nice to see it. So it's not just about compliance or the legal obligations. It's really looking at foreseeable use and durability. So I just wanted to share that other example with you as well. So what else do? We also have design verification. So this is like the product spec that we're talking about, and verifying that the product that you've made is the same as what you've designed. So it's the same as the product specification that you've developed. It's often carried out by the manufacturer themselves, and it's key. Testing is key to verify that what you've designed in, because you can use the standards. So if you have EN 71 to ensure that the product is safe, hopefully, but you're testing that just to verify that and make sure that that's safe. So the product specification is key. I just want to show you another video very quickly as well, which talks about a recipe and making a recipe. And I think this really highlights about the key importance of having a product specification or recipe, but then also about instructions. I think it's really key to ensure instructions on your product highlight certain things that people may want to be aware of if they're using your product.
I could really go for a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Okay. Do you guys think you can write down some instructions and teach me how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich?
Yeah. I'm done.
Step 1. Get 2 pieces of bread out. Got 'em. Get a butter knife and get some PB. Take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
No, Dad, with the peanut butter.
I'm just doing what it says. It says take 1 piece of bread, spread it around with the butter knife.
Hold on.
Get some jelly, rub it on the other half of the bread.
No, Dad, open the jelly.
Well, it doesn't say to do that. Put the breads together on top of each other. Take a big bite. This doesn't taste like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Fail.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I had to make it extremely specific.
Oh, good. I'm starving. Take 2 pieces of white bread out of the bag. Take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. Get a butter knife and stick it inside of the peanut butter jar. With the knife, scoop a bit of peanut butter out
A bit, that means like a lot.
A bit means a lot?
In my world.
All right. There we go.
Doing better than before, though.
Open the jelly jar. Squeeze it onto the other piece of bread.
No.
Done. Closer.
So it's important to make sure that the instructions and your product specification is as clear as possible. And don't use words like a bit, because in her world, a bit means a lot. So just be really careful. And I think it's a really good example of ensuring that your product specification, so your recipe, is as clear as possible. And also the instructions on your product, which I know that Mark and I have already spoken about. We don't really follow instructions, not many people do. Until something goes wrong, right? But the reality is that they need to be really, really clear if one day I do decide to read the instructions, or you want to make it as clear as possible. Okay, so production control is really key when it comes to product safety. So if the tested product complies, but then there's no control over production, it's almost pointless, because you want to ensure that all of the products that you're making, whether it be hundreds or thousands or millions, you need to ensure that all of them are in control and are compliant with the requirements and the obligations that you need to comply with. There are always going to be critical control points. You will know your products best, you will know your processes best, and you need to identify what those critical controls points are and highlight those and have processes in place to check them. So there might be every 101 that comes off the production line, you then check it for sharp points or something, whatever it may be. And the key thing, as Mark has already spoken about, is documenting that process and having that documentation. It can just be a little chart with a tick on it and the initial of the person that's done it, whatever works best. And that's really key to have that within your technical documentation. So statistical process control is an essential tool in quality management systems, and you can use that. If you have data, you can assess the data and you can almost estimate the probability of failure. So when we're looking at things like potentially like Z values or CPK values, it gives you an estimation and a probability. And if you have data, if you have statistical process control, it can really support that. So you need to take all measures necessary so that the manufacturing processes and the monitoring ensure that the products are compliant, and that you have as much information that demonstrates that within your technical documentation and what the requirements of the relevant directive or legislation is expecting you to do. So we can also do auditing. So Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about auditing?
Yeah,
and how
yeah.
we do that?
So when we're talking about quality management systems, they involve the inputs, the process, the outputs. Inputs have to be controlled, the process itself has to be controlled, and then some kind of quality control to ensure that it's still that it's working correctly at the end. It can seem overwhelming, it can seem complex. If you're in charge of that production process, then you'll understand what's going on, and you'll understand where the critical control points are and what you need to do to manage risk within that. But if you're looking at somebody else's system, then you need a tool. You need tools to help you say, yes, that system looks like it's okay, or maybe some things need to change. Is it adequately managing quality and therefore risk or not? And so what the PAS actually provides is it's a checklist. And I'm not a big fan of checklists normally, as Geraldine knows, but this is more of a guidance checklist about the kind of things you need to think about when you're looking at conformity assessment systems. So production systems for conformity assessment. So there is consideration of variability. What are the risks that can arise from manufacturing variation? Are they taken into account? Are there safety critical process control limits in place? And what's done to monitor those limits? And so and there are a number of checklists within the PAS. They provide you with a guide as to what kind of things you need to be looking at when you're looking at other people's production control systems for the purposes of conformity assessment. And whilst we call it audit, it is more of a verification or challenge. And so we could spend a long time talking about how to audit quality management systems, but we've obviously not got time to do that today. So instead, I'll point you towards Annex B of the PAS 7050.
And this can be, if you go to the CTSI, so the Chartered Trade and Standards Institute website, the Business Companion, you can actually download these in an editable format and make them relevant for your organisation, all of the checklists that are relevant in PAS 7050.
So we can talk about auditing processes themselves, but if you're removed from that process, what do you need to either assemble if you are undertaking the process, or need to verify if you're further down the supply chain but still taking responsibility for that product? So what does technical documentation look like? What does conformity assessment documentation look like? And if you look at the regulations, it can appear to be quite complex, but actually, again, a bit like the entire process of conformity assessment, it can be drilled down into certain overarching principles, and those overarching principles are the design is clearly stated, the design specification, and there are clear systems in place to ensure that that's what's being made on a consistent basis, and there are checks to make sure that's happening. So you always need a very clear, very comprehensive design and product specification, but you also need to consider component suppliers, specifications, safety verification of things that go in, components, raw materials. If you don't do that, then even if your process is clearly consistent, if you're putting inconsistent inconsistencies into that, you'll end up with an inconsistent product. Risk assessment. Now, risk assessment can be done from first principles, but quite often it can be done using harmonized or designated standard. That's actually a form of risk assessment. The people who write standards, they determine what the safe parameters for a product is, and they put those in the standards along with tests. And so if you are making a product to a harmonized or designated standard, then you can have that reasonable assumption that your product presents a tolerable risk of harm to users, and therefore can consider that to be most of your risk assessment. You may need to consider the context of use of the product and all those other things, but generally it's the big part of it. So if you've used standards, then you need to mention that in your technical documentation and whether or not they were applied in full or in part. Test reports are not a means of determining whether or not your product complies with a standard or other requirements. It's a means of verifying it. So it's just that verification. So test reports are part of it, but they're more a quality control indicator than a quality assurance indicator. But quality assurance records detailing the systems and the procedures and everything for the internal production control should form part of that technical documentation. And any records relating to that end-of-line quality control, rejection criteria, inspections, things like that also need to be in there. There's always going to be changes made to specifications or changes to suppliers of components or raw materials. So you need to consider those as well, because they have a direct effect on the safety and conformity of your final product. So you need to put that in there as well. So you need basically the entire management system for the production of that product needs to be referenced somehow in the technical documentation. And sometimes you have conformity assessment bodies in Europe called notified bodies, in the UK called approved bodies, who are either involved in the design verification of the product, but sometimes also involved in the quality systems, involved in the production of the product. And so anything to do with them and any actions they take or recommendations or audits or the type approval certificate need to be in that technical documentation as well. And sometimes there are other things as well, depending on the product or the supply chain or the production system. But in general, if you have these things in your technical documentation that verify the design, but also demonstrate consistency of production, then that is really what the conformity assessment documentation is about.
Great, thank you so much, Mark, for that. I think we've given a good basis on what the point of the PAS was and product safety requirements and legislation, generally speaking. So let's quickly talk about what a PAS is. We've got here on the slide PAS 0, PAS 0. I think there's an up-to-date version, actually. There's a 2022 version, but the principles are generally the same for the benefit of this webinar. So a PAS is a document that closely resembles a British standard in structure and format, but it has a different developmental model, which we'll talk about. It's usually developed in response to an identified market need as a request from a sponsor. So in this case, the sponsor for this PAS was OPSS, so the Office of Product Safety and Standards. And I really believe that this is actually the only standard like it in the world. There is nothing like it in the world that I've come across, and I know Mark agrees with me. PAS 7100 there is. So PAS 7100 is specifically about recalls and corrective actions. There are other documents globally, but there is nothing like PAS 7050 out on the market. So it definitely fills an identified market need and a gap, in my opinion. So the PAS offers an approach to effectively get a standard out there very quickly. So quickly introducing standardization, and that's what this particular PAS most certainly did. So generally intended for unrestricted use, so anybody can use it. If you are watching this webinar and you're not based in the UK or GB, then you can be using this PAS. If you're based in the US or any other country around the world, there's nothing stopping you using the PAS and looking at the references within it and the recommendations. So it's not restricted to application within the UK. It has financial sponsorship, as mentioned, and it has a compressed time scale. So it's developed very quickly in terms of the standard world to actually get it completed. And there's a short lifespan, so it gets reviewed. So every 2 years, it comes up for formal review to check to see if we need to make any changes or updates to that. And then it can grow up to be a standard an EN or BS standard, or it can remain as a PAS. It depends how it's working in the market. So they'd always love to hear feedback if you have used PAS 7050. I personally would love to hear feedback. I know Mark would as well, and BSI. So you can send the information across, and you can do that through CTSI as well if you like. So it's entrusted to a technical author. So that was my role in this, was to help develop the standard with the support of the steering group. So consensus is key. Consensus is not easy, especially when you have a huge steering group. So I believe on this one, it was about 29, which was fun. But also it makes the PAS really valuable because you have so many different steering group members that have a lot of knowledge and experience in this area. So that was phenomenal, and a huge thanks to them. And it's a tool devised for those who want to use it. If you don't want to use it, then don't use it. That's not a problem at all. And it is voluntary, but as we've already highlighted, so are most other standards. So it's not something you have to comply with, but it's definitely a guide for those who want to use it and want to ensure that they're bringing safe products to market. So just to let you know, for your information, you get different types of PASs. I actually wasn't aware of this until I started working on these, that you can have a specification, or you can have a code of practice, or a guide, or a test method. So PAS 7050 and 7100 are codes of practice. So they're recommendations, they're guidance. You kind of take from it what you will, you adapt it and make it relevant for you. A specification is a coherent set of absolute requirements. So I mentioned earlier about PAS 7055, which is on button and coin batteries. That is a specification. If you want to comply with PAS 7055, you need to comply with the requirements that are within that PAS. And just to let you know, randomly pick some other random PASs that are available out on the market. There you can see some examples of a guide and test methods. They are not all free to download. Again, a huge thanks to OPSS, but PAS 7050, 7100 and 7055 are all free to download, which is phenomenal for all businesses because we know that things are tight, especially at the moment. So just so you can see the front covers of these PASs, this is 7050 on the left, which is bringing safe products to market, and then 7100 on the right. 7050 is the encompassing all, how do you bring, what's your processes, what's your product safety management plans, and how do you bring safe products to market? And then PAS 7050 is just one piece of that. If something goes wrong, are you prepared when it goes wrong? And we will talk about some examples in part 2 of this webinar. So let's look at the outline. As mentioned, quite cheekily, there's one section because it's got my name in it, which I was very proud of. And the other organisations in the steering group in the forward, and of course the ministerial statement, which is very important, and the introduction, which really sets the scene. You can be a lot freer with the language that you use in the introduction. So I highly recommend that you read the introduction and the annexes, which we will talk about. And we have part 1 for businesses and part 2 for regulators. The regulator section is a little bit smaller, and we'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. But part 1 is for businesses. We've got the scope. We've got the normative references. So what other references do you need to read? You might be surprised to hear it's 7100 for this. And then you've got terms, definitions, and abbreviated terms, which are really key and can sometimes spend a lot of time talking about those when you're developing PASs or standards. So the product safety management plan, so section 4 is the real key part of it. That's where a lot of the information is. So what should a product safety management plan include? And then there are specific shorter sections for online marketplaces, repairers and refurbishers, and distributors and importers of second-hand products. And fundamentally, what we're saying in those sections is that they should have a PSMP, which by now you'll know is a product safety management plan. So as mentioned, it was sponsored by OPSS, the Office of Product Safety and Standards, as a guide for both economic operators and market surveillance. It's not a legal requirement, but it does have a persuasive quality. I think, if you're ever challenged or you're having a conversation with market surveillance and you talk about PAS 7050, it's like you're on the same level. If you understand what it is and you understand the principles, and it can make those conversations go a lot easier. And there's 2 parts as mentioned. So part 1 for businesses, economic operators, and part 2 for regulators, which is similar for 7100 as well. There's an absolute wealth of knowledge and expertise, and it was an absolute honour and privilege to work with all of these organisations in the development of this PAS. As you can see, a huge number of organisations. So there's a lot of knowledge and expertise that has gone into developing this PAS. So a huge thank you to those steering group members. So part 2 for regulators, I think the key part about this, you can read this section yourself, is about support. They are there to support businesses. So if you want help in developing your product safety management plan or your product safety incident plan, or you have an issue, or you want to talk about something, it doesn't even have to be safety related, actually. If you have primary authority, they have such a huge wealth of knowledge and expertise in the trading standards department. So you can contact them and have a primary authority relationship where they can give you lots of advice related to businesses. So it's definitely worth working with the trading standards department under primary authority, and they will help support you in developing both of these plans should you want to do that. And then it talks about responding proportionately where businesses fail to meet their legal obligations. The annexes, so Annex A to E, as mentioned previously, if you go to the CTSI website, so the Chartered Trading Standards Institute Business Companion, you can download these annexes in an editable format. So you can change the sections, you can add parts to this, you can write the answers or write the observations, or whether you feel that you're meeting them, and do it as a bit of a gap analysis. And maybe it'll even be confirmation that a lot of what you're doing is already in here, and that's really great to do that. So Annex A is for all businesses, Part B is specifically manufacturers, C online marketplaces, but each of those you should use back with A. So if you're a manufacturer, you should be using A and B. If you're an online marketplace, you should be using A and C. And then Annex F and G are informative annexes that talk about what's technical documentation and what other documentation could you have for supporting compliance. And then Annex G talks about due diligence and what that means. Okay, so we're actually coming to the end of the part 1 of this webinar, and we hope to see you back in part 2 of the webinar, where we'll talk about how to prepare and how to develop product safety management plan and a product safety incident plan. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully see you soon.